Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we will be sewing a men's Hmoob length shirt. Take your front shirt pattern piece and pin it down on your fabric. You'll want to cut out two pieces of this. I folded my fabric over so that I can cut out both pieces at the same time. Repeat this process with a lining fabric. My lining fabric is red here, so we can tell the difference. Next, take your crossover panel and make sure you fold your fabric over so that you can cut on the fold. Do not cut out the fold. You want this to be all one piece. Then you want to go ahead right away and pin the top and the bottom of the crossover panel together and then sew this closed, both the top and the bottom. Next, I'm going to take the crossover panel pattern and cut out some interfacing. I'll be using the interfacing to iron onto my crossover panel. Now, if you're going to use a Hmoob length trim on your men's shirt, do not use the fusible interfacing because it will be too thick. If you're going to make the original shirt without a trim, then go ahead and use the fusible interfacing like I have. Iron it on, flip it over, and iron the piece flat. Next, we'll be connecting the shirt fabric to the lining fabric, and we'll use the crossover panel on the right side of the men's shirt. So it'll look like your left when you're facing it. So lay the shirt fabric flat, put the crossover panel on top, make sure it's ½ inch up from the bottom, and then lay the lining fabric on top, pin everything together, and sew a ½ inch seam from the top at the neckline down around the bottom over to the side. So exactly where I pinned all the needles. And you'll want to do the same thing to the left side of the shirt, but there won't be a crossover panel there. So how you want to sew is the ½ inch seam all the way over to the corner. Stick your needle in, pick up your foot, pivot the fabric, put your foot back down, and then continue sewing your ½ inch. Next, you'll cut away the corners so that there's less fabric to create a bulky look in that corner, and then flip it inside out completely so that the seam is all on the inside, and then iron everything close. I use a needle to get the corners out so that it's a nice sharp corner. And you'll want to repeat this process with the other side of the shirt. This side is the right side, so you can see the crossover panel now pops out. And go ahead and just iron all your seams nice and flat. These are our completed front shirt pieces. You'll see the crossover panel, and that's how it looks when you actually wear it. Here's where you want to sew on any Hmoob length trims if you're deciding that you would like a trim on your men's top. Next up, take your back shirt pattern piece and cut out the base fabric and a lining fabric. And before you even remove your pattern, this is where you'd want to take your tracing paper, put it down in between the fabric and your pattern, take a tracing wheel and trace out the back dart. You can pin your fabric piece together so that it stays still, and then you can go ahead and sew the darts on both the lining and the base fabric. Just follow along the traced out dart line. Make sure that you iron your darts flat on both the lining and the shirt. Now we want to sew the lining to the shirt fabric. Lay the shirt fabric good side facing up and lay the lining fabric good side facing down. That way your seams are on the outside. Then you want to pin along the bottom of the shirt, and that's where you're going to sew the shirt together. After it's connected and sewn together, you want to flip the shirt and the lining open, and this is a ironing technique. First iron the seam nice and flat, and then flip all the way over and iron again. This helps to prevent any excess fabric from going into the seam. And this is what your back shirt looks like once the lining is attached. And this is where you would want to sew a trim at the very bottom if you decided that you want to sew a trim onto your shirt. Once you have that all done, if you decide to put on a trim, then we're going to connect the front and back pieces together at the shoulders. After pinning, sew the pieces together using a 1/2 inch seam, and don't forget to serge to create a clean edge. Make sure to iron your shoulder seams so you get a nice flat and clean seam. Next up is to cut out our sleeves. Make sure that you are cutting on the fold of a fabric so that you get one big sleeve. If you cut on the edge of a fabric, you will only get half a sleeve and you'll have to recut. So cut out 2 sleeves and make sure you also cut out lining for these sleeves. Take the cuff pattern and also cut out 2 cuffs for your sleeve. Sew all the pieces together to create your sleeves. Lay the sleeve fabric down first, then the cuff fabric, and then finally the lining fabric. Pin them all together down at the wrist, and you're going to sew them together using a 1/2 inch seam all the way across. You'll need to iron your sleeve, so using the same tip as before, first flip over your lining, iron that seam flat, and then flip over your lining completely to the back and iron the seam again. Next, take a ruler and you're going to measure out about 4 inches here, and you're going to chalk where that 4 inches lie so that you can flip over your cuff here and sew it down using a top stitch. Once I have the chalk as a marker, I use an iron to actually iron right along the chalk line so that my fabric flips underneath nice and flat, and then I use a pin to hold that down so I can sew my top stitch. Here are my completed sleeves, and now I'm ready to attach both of them onto my shirt. Now I'm ready to attach my sleeves to my shirt. Make sure that the shirt fabric is facing the shirt fabric. And I like to start in the center of the sleeve as well as the shoulder of the sleeve and work my way out. So when you're pinning, you're not pinning right on the edge, you're pinning a 1/2 inch away from the edge. So you have to imagine where you'd be sewing, and that's the 1/2 inch line. Once you're done pinning, you can go ahead and start sewing. Don't remove any pins until you get right to it. This helps to keep the fabric in place so that you don't create a lot of bunching around the sleeves. The sleeves are a little tricky because there is some extra fabric, and that extra fabric is there for ease so that you have room when you're moving around your arms comfortably in your shirt. So to help prevent bunching, I like to pull the edge of the fabric towards the needle. Once you're all done sewing, go ahead and serge. And here's our shirt with both sleeves attached and serged. This is what it looks like. One of the final steps here is to sew the sleeves and the sides closed so that you can wear the top. And to do that, I start at the wrist and make sure that it's evenly matched. And then I make sure that the cuff is evenly matched, and you can check that by flipping the fabric over so that you could see where the blue is matching up. Then for this particular shirt, you need to match up the bottom as well because there's a clean finished edge at the bottom, not a raw edge, so they need to match up. So I like to go from the wrist down to the bottom of the shirt and then work my way into the middle. Once you have all the pins in, go ahead and sew it all together using a 1/2 inch seam. Don't forget to serge everything closed. And here is our shirt almost done with our sides all closed up and serged. We're going to flip it over and you can see what it looks like with all the pieces completed. The very final step here is to bind the neckline. To do that, take your bind pattern, and you can see here we put a diagonal arrow on the pattern. You don't want to cut your fabric horizontal or vertical. You want to go ahead and cut at a diagonal. And this is also called bias. And the reason for this is because the fabric on a bias is a little more stretchy. And that'll help because the neckline is in a circle. And so you'll need that bit of stretch so that you can bind your neckline without stiffness. Here's our neck binding, and we want to go all the way around the neckline. I like to start on the left, and you want to make sure that the binding is actually a 1/2 inch beyond where you want to start, and that your seam allowance here is about a 1/4 inch. You'll wrap this all the way around the neckline over to the other side. Once you get around to the other end, you'll want to leave about a 1/2 inch of fabric left over. You can cut away any excess after the 1/2 inch. And then you want to go back to where you started. And to bind, you'll want to fold your binding fabric so it meets the lining on the inside. And then you'll want to fold it over again to create a nice tight bind. Don't forget that you want to close the ends, so fold that down so that everything is tucked inside. Once you have it nice and tight, you slip it under your sewing machine and bind right along the seam where the blue fabric and the black fabric meets. And you'll want to repeat this and go a little bit slow, fold as you go. If you like to fold ahead of time and pin it, that's also a technique you can use. But you'll want to do this all the way around to the other side. And when you get to the other side, fold your fabric all in the inside, and so you'll get a nice clean look. This is our completed men's Hmoob shirt. I've gone ahead and sewn on snap-ons on the inside so that everything can be closed and ready to wear.